Okay, so I'm going to get us started here. Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Chaos to Concept, The Power of Design Thinking. This program is proudly sponsored by P&G Ventures, Kroger, First Financial, North American Properties, Bora Ventures, and Taft. Today's webinar will also have a Q&A session. As usual, use the Q&A tool at the bottom of your screen. Elisa will be answering questions throughout the presentation, so as soon as you think of a question, just feel free to type it in the chat and in the Q&A tool, and we will get to it. A recorded version of today's webinar will be provided a few days after this event, and a survey as usual will be provided as you click out, so don't forget to fill it out on your way out as well. Thank you all so much for attending. I will hand it off to Elisa Smith, Director of Corporate Innovation Services, to get us started.
Thanks, Zaina. Hi, everyone. I am really excited to be able to talk to you guys today about design thinking, so let's jump right into it. Okay, so today's objective is just to give you a practical introduction to design thinking. And basically that means human-centered design. It includes mindsets and methods, and so we will talk about that. The agenda is first I'll give you a little background about myself, as well as how design thinking got started. We'll then talk about design thinking, the mindset, the modes, the phases and tools, and then I'll give a little summary. And like Zaina said, I'm open to questions throughout. Okay, so first background. So with regard to my background, I went to school for chemical engineering. I also have an MBA or an MBA, and I spent the last 21 years at CPG companies, focusing on research and development. 6 of my years were spent at P&G working on Crest and Scope. And then I spent 15 years at Kao, which is a Japan-based CPG company. It's based mainly in Tokyo. And at Kao, I focused on Jergens and Curel, so all skincare. That included all of the products that are listed there. That's just a few of the products that I worked on. It doesn't include the numerous discontinued projects or products, the canceled projects, all of the clinical and consumer tests. I guess I say all of this to say that innovation and product development and product design means lots of product launches sometimes, but it can also mean lots of starts and stops. So during my years at Cal especially, what I started to notice was that even though we many times had superior products, that people weren't necessarily buying products that were superior. Even if we tested competitive products that were superior, people weren't necessarily buying those products at a great rate. And so basically people don't buy the best products. They actually buy products that communicate relevance in the fastest possible way. And so that was a big thing for me to learn at Cal, that sometimes in the marketplace, if you're not able to communicate relevance, it doesn't matter, even if you have the best products. And relevance isn't something that's based simply on launching a new technology. It's not about saying, hey, in the marketplace, there's this white space, so we should launch this thing. Consumers aren't really focused on buying technology for the sake of technology. There has to be a really clear fit with the consumer's lives and needs. And so this is really, really important. So many times companies will focus on an inside out approach. This is really solutions first. So it's focused on asking the wrong questions. So trying to understand, what is the competition doing? How can we advance technologies? This leads to analytical thinking, which is really thinking that's focused only on the numbers and seeing, where's the competition going and how much money is in that area, and should we launch based on that? It also leads to incremental growth and commoditization. Technology is everywhere nowadays, and it's really easy to get access to it. The marketplace is very crowded. So the big question is, how can you get attention within a crowded market space, knowing that if you launch a new technology, your competitor can probably come in really, really fast with the same technology. So how do you avoid being commoditized in the marketplace? So this solutions first approach is really focused on launching technology. It's also focused on understanding functional performance. So many times companies will try to test their formulas, they will try to test competitive formulas or competitive products or services to understand and observe what's happening there. The focus will be on what behaviors does the consumer exhibit, what are their habits and practices, but really instead the focus should be on what's driving actual action. So the behavior is the outcome. The input is actually consumers' perceptions, their thoughts, their fears, their aspirations. So really thinking about who the consumer wants to be, their motivations for acting in a certain way, as well as their frustrations. Design thinking came about, well, it started to happen back in the 60s. There was a thought that maybe companies were too focused on functional design, so practical application of a product or service. And there was a desire to be more creative, and design thinking has evolved since then, of course. I just wanted to give you guys an example, a good example, I think, of design thinking. So take Marriott on the right side. Marriott was founded in 1927. They have a valuation of about $28 billion, and they're currently active in about 131 countries. Whenever they launch new services or new products, their focus is really on changing what they already have. It's the same business model over and over. Airbnb, in contrast, was founded in 2008, so they are not that old. They have 7 million listings now, which is more listings than you could say Marriott has. Their marketplace valuation is $35 billion, and their focus is on belong anywhere. So this is more of an emotional focus. It's an emotional value proposition. And this is how Airbnb has been able to win in the marketplace. Just as an example, the belong anywhere idea has enabled Airbnb to launch different product ideas based on belonging. Their main product was, of course, launching into basically having people rent out or lease out their spaces, residential spaces initially, but they also have a focus on, feeling at home wherever your job takes you, for example, which is a really, really different idea, I think. And also their focus is on, having a space or experiences that lead to team building, and also just having spaces that spark creativity. This is really important. Whenever I was in corporate America and I needed to get my team together to think about a new concept that we needed to launch, or to think about the consumer and brainstorm around consumer needs, I was always looking for places to get my brainstorming done, places that were not in the office, because whenever you do work in the office, many times that leads to people not being really, really focused. So it's really good to get out of the office. So, they launched these spaces also for people who want to get away. It was always hard to find spaces that were inexpensive. So I imagine that this is a really good product from them. They have also launched online experiences, which allow consumers to basically to understand and learn from chefs. These are things that you actually have to pay for. So it allows you to have more of a cultural experience, and still to understand how you might experience a culture, even from your home. So I feel like this is something that they probably pivoted to as a result of the pandemic, because people maybe are afraid to get out. So let's talk about design thinking. First, we'll talk about mindset. So design thinking is, according to IDEA, it has human-centered as a core, and it encourages organizations to focus on the people they're creating for, which leads to better products, services, and internal processes. So it makes you question the human need behind whatever you're doing versus thinking about the business need first. And whenever you're thinking about design thinking, you're employing or pulling from all needs. So it is the consumer need first, but you're combining that with the business need and the technology need. Design thinking includes mindsets and modes. So again, we'll go over mindsets first. Mindsets include the beliefs around, first it's about learning from failure. Actually, first it's about being human-centered, embracing ambiguity. So even though you may not know, based on a consumer insight or human insight, what needs to come next as far as the product or service, you have to embrace that ambiguity and just keep moving forward. It's also about having creative confidence that you can find a solution and being optimistic in that. It's about collaborating both with the consumer and also with your team. It's about just making something, so prototyping, and then after you prototype, at least after you have your first prototype or second prototype, it's also about iterating from there and then learning from failure. The principles of design thinking, therefore, include empathy, optimism, collaboration, and experimentation. I think that empathy is the biggest thing to focus on with design thinking. And this empathy is really about having the capacity to step into someone else's shoes and immersing yourself into their world. I don't know if everyone attended Fernando Garabi's webinar last week, but I love what he said about how he wants this music to feel like a hug for the people who need a hug. So I think empathy and being human-centered is like that. So next, let's talk about modes. Modes are frameworks and methods. So as far as modes, this is really about design thinking modes as far as knowing when you're supposed to be converging or diverging on an idea. And this just really shows that at the very beginning of design thinking, this is when you're getting inspiration from the consumer, you're really having or you're really focusing on a divergent mindset. So you're trying to get as many ideas as possible. After that, you're going to converge to fewer ideas, and then you'll get some more insight and you'll diverge, and then you'll converge again. And you just keep doing this until you get to a solution. Next, let's talk about phases and tools that you can use. So for design thinking, it can be broken up into at least 3 phases. You can also have more phases, but I just wanted to use these 3 just to be simple for today. There's inspiration, and in this phase, you'll learn how to better how to better understand people. So you will observe their lives, understand their hopes, their frustrations, their desires, etc. In the ideation mode, then this is where you think about what you learned in the inspiration mode, and you try to make sense of that. And then the last piece is implementation, and this is when you're coming up with the solution for the problem. So let's talk about inspiration. We'll go a little bit deeper here. For inspiration, for this particular phase, you will be framing your design challenge research. So this is about thinking through the people, the experts that you want to talk to, also the immersive experiences you could have. You can also find analogous inspiration. So for example, when I was in product development, I loved thinking about how other industries were solving a problem that I had, and then taking inspiration from those and designing it into the product that I wanted to create. So yeah, within the inspiration phase, you'll just be really exploring different ways to understand people, like I said. So you're thinking about what people say versus what they think and how they feel. And it can feel a little foreboding, I think, to think that you'll be asking people how they feel, but there are some tools available for this. One tool, like I said earlier, is to think about where you can look for inspiration. And this would be different people or places that you can go to understand the need. So like I said, for analogous inspiration, I used to work on sunless tanners. So when I wanted to think about color, I would sometimes go and look and see what are they doing in the paint industry as a way of solving for color, or as a way of communicating color needs or thinking about color needs. And I would use that as inspiration for products. Whenever you're in the inspiration mode, it's also good to think about extremes and mainstays. I think designing in the middle means that products and services are going to be more generic and easier to copy. It's good to look at the extremes because then you'll see like what fewer people are doing, and you can kind of design something that maybe it's a little bit polarizing, especially to the opposite end of the spectrum, but it's also something that it's giving attention to people who probably aren't getting attention right now. And so it could lead to higher, I guess, higher revenue in the marketplace. So it's nice to know what's happening on the extremes. And as far as the mainstream, that kind of will tell you the average thing that's happening. So not necessarily the place that you want to be unless you're launching a mass product. So as far as what you need to consider as you're learning, you really need to think about the entire person. So the whole person, like I said earlier, and I can't emphasize this enough, you really want to think about the values, the needs, the desires, and aspirations that people have. And it's also good to get into the right context. So for example, bringing someone to you, recruiting them and saying, hey, come to my office and talk to me, it doesn't necessarily get the full understanding of what's happening. It's really good to talk to people in their own context. So if you can go into people's homes, for example, which is a little bit difficult, it's very difficult right now. But in normal circumstances, it's good to go into people's homes or to talk to them in context whenever they're using a particular product or service or thinking about that product or service. So here's an example activity. So this is like a traditional way of interviewing. You could ask your neighbor, what gets in the way of being healthy? You'll get a lot of surfacey answers. The way to drill down from there is to, there are different techniques. These are just a few, but one way is to ask why over and over, and it will get more and more into an emotional level, and that helps with understanding the consumer. Another way is to have the human or consumer to draw what they're saying or to show you what they're seeing, how they're experiencing things and how they are interpreting things. They can show you what they mean when they say they're seeing a certain thing. Also, you can get them to tell you a story about that. There are other techniques. The 5W1H method is just when you ask who, what, when, where, why, and how as a way of really understanding the entire context. So these things can be combined when you're talking to the person that you're targeting. Okay, the next phase is ideation. This is where you make sense of everything that you've heard and you start to think about what potential solutions are. So we'll go through this. So this has actually, I'm just going to show you this. This has 3 different parts. One is synthesis. This is whenever you download your learnings, you start to think about how might we's. Then the second area is brainstorming. This is whenever you start brainstorming different ideas. And whenever you start prototyping, this is really about drawing out your ideas and kind of storyboarding and thinking through the sequence that a consumer might take throughout the solution. So for example, if your solution is a process, like a website, for example, you could start storyboarding the website just to outline the different steps and how the consumer would interact with that. So again, there's synthesis, which is really making sense of what you've heard. I'm going to go through this quickly just so we have time for questions. So an example here is downloading your learnings. And this is an example activity that you can do. This is really basically for the team, jotting down what you've heard and then sharing it among yourselves. And after you do that, then you can find themes and insights. So you can bucket each idea or each insight into different buckets. And those buckets can become your solution ideas, for example, or they can just be buckets, general buckets. And then based on that, based on those buckets, then you can say, how might we do whatever? So this is where you would start to narrow in on the different ideas that you have. And prototyping, this is about bringing those ideas to life. So again, prototyping involves storyboarding. It can include rapid prototyping, getting feedback and integrating that feedback and iterating. And I'll just go through these really fast. So for storyboarding, like I said, this is breaking your idea down into smaller moments of the experience and thinking about how your consumer, how you might want your consumer to react or what they may be experiencing throughout those steps. And this shows different ways of building a prototype. So a prototype could be a physical prototype, like lotion, for example. It could be digital, so like a website or an app. It could also be an environment. So this could be something that you set up as an environment for someone to experience. And it could be a service. So there are different types of prototypes that you can create. After you have a prototype, you want to go back to the target consumer and to get their feedback on whether or not what you've created fits their needs. So this is just a general, like a rough prototype that you can get feedback on before you actually build whatever that thing is. And once you get feedback, then you can start iterating and start refining on that prototype. The final phase is implementation, and this is when you bring your solution to life. It's whenever you're thinking about how your idea fits in the marketplace and how to maximize the impact. So for this, you're going to keep iterating, you're going to do some live prototyping, and maybe do some pilots. Okay, so in summary, for design thinking, you want to start with understanding a human need. You want to start translating and iterating from there to create a solution. A rough solution is fine. But you also want to test in context, if possible. And also, it's good to know going in that innovation is it's not easy. It's sometimes not necessarily scary, but it can be because sometimes it's hard to know whether or not you'll be able to come up with a solution, but that's where the design thinking mindsets come in. There's a solution that exists. It's just a matter of continuing to try to find it. And also, it's very important to keep the focus on empathy and creating relevance. I have some references here. So first, I want to say that in thinking about whatever the solution is, it's good to have, of course, that deep consumer need in mind, but also there's business model innovation that you can do. So Airbnb is a really good example of this. There are many different ways to innovate on business models. And then the third piece is thinking about technology as something that empowers. This is really important, rather than thinking that technology should be launched or could be launched successfully just for technology's sake. Some of my favorite books here that I use for thinking about consumer needs and business model innovation are shown here. So there's Jobs to Be Done, which is a really great book by Anthony Ulrich. There's also Value Proposition Design. This really gets into the understanding consumer needs and understanding how to test for that. 10 Types of Innovation is really about business model innovation and testing business ideas. That helps with understanding, once you have a solution, different ways that you could rapidly test those ideas. And business model generation brings it all together from a business viability perspective and helps you with understanding and seeing, I guess, from a high level perspective, how your business model could fit and could work in the marketplace. So that's it. Any questions? Okay, and I actually see a few here. So Patrick asks, how do you avoid getting too much input from consumers? won't it get crowded having too many consumers polled or too many points of view to draw solutions from? So yeah, that can get difficult. Whenever I was talking about talking to consumers and interviewing consumers, this could be a small number of consumers, so you could keep it maybe to 5 to 10 people initially. And then I think whenever you're talking to consumers, really drilling down to the main, I guess the main points, that's really, really important. That helps you. You'll still get a lot of input, but it's really, I think, on the back end, understanding which parts you want to analyze and which parts you want to pull forward. So it's really good to know going in, I guess, what your objective is or what you think it could be. So having a hypothesis and then talking to the consumer and continuing to iterate even on that hypothesis and pulling in the information that you've heard based on that hypothesis from the consumer that you've confirmed. So hopefully that makes sense, but that's a really good way to stay focused. And I think also minimizing the number of consumers you're talking to helps with the focus as well. Okay, Zand asked, what sparked my interest in focusing my career on innovation? So I grew up in a really small town and I have never, I guess I was bored a lot growing up. So I didn't like to experience the same thing over and over. I've never wanted to experience the same things over and over. So I guess I've just always had innovation and change as a desire. And yeah, I don't know. I was recruited into P&G. I didn't really know what product development was at the time. I didn't necessarily happen upon it. I did want to create products eventually. So I guess product development and chemical engineering, I think also were a great fit for me. And yeah, I think my interest really in innovation is a desire for change, just in general. There's another question. When you worked in skincare, did you ever tap into different demographics? And if so, how did you market new products? So yes, we tapped into different demographics a lot. We talked to people with different skin tones. That's the way I like to see it. And tried to understand their experiences and their needs based on that. I think marketing, especially in the mass world, marketing to different demographics can be difficult because you're trying to meet mass needs. And that's what I meant by, the products becoming more generic. It gets really hard at mass to communicate the needs of different consumers. So I think the marketing piece to me is more communication. And for that, you have to know emotionally as well as physically what your target is and what the consumer's language is and how they talk about that. So matching both of those things, so the emotion from the consumer and the physical needs. So what is it that they see on their skin, for example, versus what they want to see? Those are ways that we were able to market to different consumers based on demographics, while still having a product that might be more generic as far as the number of people that it would solve for, or the number of concerns it would solve for. Let's see, Zand is asking, what advice would you give high school and college students as they think about innovation as part of preparing for their pitch competitions? Well, I think I would focus on the problem to be solved. That's the biggest thing, and understanding the emotion and keeping in mind what that emotion is and what the end benefit is emotion-wise that you're trying to get to, because that will keep you focused and motivated throughout your process. And whenever you have the pitch competition, I guess I would just use that emotion to drive your storytelling and what you're saying so that you're talking with passion. So it gets back to stepping into the consumer shoes and showing empathy and having passion based on that. What's my favorite part of the design thinking process? What is most rewarding? The design thinking process, I think my favorite part is the empathy piece, because I love talking to people and understanding their needs. And then I guess my second favorite piece is figuring out and thinking about what a solution is going to be based on the needs. So it's kind of a toss up between those two, probably though, because I really love product development and product design and thinking in that way. But I also love talking to people and understanding their needs and measuring their needs if I can. So, for example, we would measure color on skin or we would measure dryness on skin. I love thinking about those measurements in reference to what I'm hearing from consumers. What I think is most rewarding is seeing a product in the marketplace and actually being at the shelf and seeing people take that product off the shelf and purchase it. It's just rewarding to know that you've launched something that can help people.
Lisa, I have a quick question. Does the design thinking process look different, or is it lengthier, or is it just different depending on like where you're working? So like such a big company like P&G, did it look different from like how you use it here at Centrifuge?
Oh, well, I will say at Centrifuge, my focus is more on helping corporations to bring innovation in from the outside. So yeah, it's very, very different. I think the design thinking was more different between P&G and Cal, I think. At P&G, there are people who focus specifically on the consumer, like many people who only think consumer and interview consumers and bring that information back to the formulators so that the formulators can develop solutions. So at P&G, the formulators are a little bit more separate, at least they were when I was there, a little bit more separate from the actual consumer. At Cal, during my time there, the formulator did both the consumer understanding as well as the formulation piece. So I think that design thinking between different organizations is very, very different.
Okay, thank you. We have one more question in the chat as well, asking what is your favorite product you've worked on developing, and how did a design-focused mindset help you in that process?
I think so. My favorite product, it was actually a line of products. So I think my favorite project was when I worked at Cal, and our goal was to figure out. So we had an issue with malodor. This was for sunless tanners, and we needed to relaunch the entire line of Jergens Natural Glow. That was my favorite project because it included understanding what the consumer meant by odor and what issues there may have been from a color perspective on skin, and also taking that information and creating new technology. So for odor, we were able to come up with a completely new way of approaching it. And also for color, we were able to figure out some things from a formulation perspective that led to significantly better color, and overall the product was just better. We had to relaunch 14 products, and we only had a couple of years to do it. I think that was my favorite because of the technology piece, the consumer piece, but also because of the teamwork piece. So it involved working very, very closely with my formulators in Cincinnati, as well as collaborating with the teams in Japan to come up with some new things. So that was really fun because it meant, different meetings with both teams, and also traveling to Japan to understand what they were doing and having them come here to understand what we were doing. And it was just a really fun time. Although scary at times because we were relaunching one of our major lines, and the idea that you would do that is scary because it could potentially have meant losing a lot of millions of dollars in the marketplace. So it was scary, but a lot of fun too. There's a question here. How did you use design thinking when you worked with big groups of people and lots of ideas? Whenever I have big groups of people, I like to separate people into smaller groups. And then, first is everyone putting their idea onto a board, and then separating into smaller groups to break the information down into chunks. So each group can take a bucket and then work on things from there. And then you have to figure out, okay, based on those buckets, how do they all fit together? and how can we consolidate that into an idea or several ideas. So I think it's first just breaking it down into chunks and then creating buckets. Cheryl asks, when designing a new product, what is the biggest challenge that all entrepreneurs should be prepared to face? I think the biggest challenge came up earlier, and it was around the input of many, many, many different ideas, or the input from many, many different consumers. I think the biggest challenge is focusing and trying to understand, because you have to place your bets. Where do you focus? So I think that's the biggest challenge. And sometimes stepping away from the board helps, and then coming back. But yeah, that's the biggest challenge because sometimes it's hard to know where the focus should be. Some of the books that I gave as references should help. And again, it's about understanding your hypotheses or creating hypotheses and testing those along the way. That can really help with streamlining and getting down to the right answer. But yeah, I think focus is the biggest challenge. Patrick asks, have you ever been on the front line of getting consumer feedback? For instance, have you ever gone into consumers' homes and interviewed them? Yes, I have. I've gone into their homes, I've brought them into different facilities, and I've interviewed them. Like, I've been the person sitting there interviewing them with people behind a mirror listening. And yeah, it's you have to keep a straight face and tell them you want honesty. And sometimes they will say your product sucks, and you just have to deal with that and really try to understand what does that mean exactly, so that you can get to a solution that really helps consumers. So yeah, that can be fun as well, but also you don't necessarily always hear the best news from that. So you just have to be prepared to to understand and focus on the understanding and deal with the implications of what you're hearing from the consumer. Let's see, what was the best solution for a hard problem you encountered? This is from Jasmine. So I think there are many hard problems you can encounter as a researcher, and I think the best solutions are always those. It's always those that incorporate diverse opinions, so opinions from many different people on your team versus just thinking of the solution yourself. So for example, I mentioned the Jurgen's natural flow earlier. That was a really, really hard problem to be solved, extremely hard, because we had so many different challenges that we had to get solved basically. And we worked as a team to do that. So I could have sat down and said, okay, here's one of the challenges, how would I solve it? But that would not have gotten us to the solution that we got to. So I think that best solutions are always obtained via collaboration.
One more. So going back to the customer feedback, like when you get poor customer feedback, what would you recommend to do to kind of use that as encouragement instead of like getting down and feeling bad about it?
Yeah, I think you have to see it as an opportunity to improve. So research and design thinking are all about continuous improvement. So I see it as, oh, this is something new that we could launch, or this is a way that we can improve what we currently have, versus thinking of it as, this impacts me personally. So the feedback from consumers is never personal. They don't know you. They don't necessarily know that you're working on the product or the service that you're asking them questions about. So I would say don't be emotionally attached to any idea at all. See each idea as a stepping stone to the next thing. And whenever you launch a project, or I'm sorry, whenever you launch a product, a service, or a business, you always want to think about it as your first iteration. Even in the marketplace, you're going to want to iterate, just like Airbnb is doing. So don't be emotionally tied to anything.
Well, thanks so much, Elisa. If we don't have any more questions, I think I'm gonna wrap it up. Yep, I think we're good to go. Um, Anyways, thank you everyone for taking the time to join us today. Thank you again, Elisa, for sharing so many of your insights with us today. The
You're welcome.
recorded version of this webinar will be available in the next few days. Students, we would love to hear your feedback. Please, as usual, fill out the survey on your way out. Tune back in tomorrow at 12 for our next webinar, Enabler versus Disruptor, Pick Your Path with David Hollaba, the Principal Product Manager at Kroger. Have a great rest of your day, everyone.